Does anybody else remember those old see-through Mad Catz controllers from the 90s? I'll have a picture up here if you don't, but those were my absolute favorite controllers of all time. And I'm happy to say Transparent Tech is making an absolute comeback with loads of modern features at a surprisingly affordable price. With remappable buttons, turbo functions, and Hall effect sticks, coming in at below 50 bucks, you've got the GameSir K4 Collide. And this is the first wired controller that I think I've ever reviewed, and it looks actually pretty promising, so let's get into it. Off the bat, I already know there's not going to be much in this package since, well, it's a wired controller. Getting right into it, we have the controller itself, which actually feels pretty lightweight. Understandable since it doesn't have a battery. And then you've got the Type A to C cable, which is the removable cable that you'd hook up to either your PC or Nintendo Switch. And that's it. And my first impressions, it's actually pretty freaking good. This simply does not feel like a $42 controller. Even though it's lightweight, this controller has absolutely zero give or creaking, which I can't say for my Xbox controller. So that's definitely a pleasant surprise. Aesthetically, it takes me back to the 90s with the transparent tech and bubble chairs being a big thing, but it actually looks pretty cool. The back end is frosted, which acts sort of like a grip, and the triggers do also have little bumpy grips as well. For buttons, you've got a layout almost identical to the Xbox controller, and frankly, it's actually shaped identical as well, which for me is actually a huge plus. The buttons on the back end are remappable as well, which I will get to, and of course there's a Type C port on top for the removable cable. And the thing people will enjoy with this controller is the RGB. For myself, RGB isn't really my thing, so I'm happy that I can turn it off. Either way, it's there if you do want to use it. A major consideration too is that it's actually really comfortable to hold. Okay, so when it comes down to the features on this controller, the first thing I want to touch on are the Hall effect sticks. If you're unfamiliar with Hall effect stick modules, it isn't new. It actually dates way back to the Dreamcast if you remember that thing. It just means, unlike the plagued Nintendo Joy-Cons, these sticks will never get stick drift. And not to mention, the sticks are actually super clicky. And when it comes to the buttons on here, again, for 42 bucks, it simply doesn't make sense. Taking a look into the controller, because you can do that, it doesn't look like there's any sort of membrane or anything like that, but rather each button is mechanical, which definitely makes sense considering how clicky these are. The A, B, X, Y buttons do seem a little bit harder to press than traditional buttons, but I actually didn't know I preferred this up until now. And similar to the A, B, X, Y, the D-pad is also super clicky. And there are these two buttons on the back end if you do want to remap these to something else. This can be done on a Windows PC using their T4 Collide software. And low-key, my favorite feature of this entire controller, I have to say, is actually the headphone jack. The original Joy-Cons didn't have this at all. I like to use my Sony XM5s while playing, and this is an absolute must-have if you're playing games like Overwatch or any other first-person shooter. Lastly, this is the function button, which helps set up certain pro features, which I'll touch on. And depending on what you're playing, you might be using the triggers a whole lot, and while they do have complete full travel like any other controller, you can set this up to act like a hairline trigger that you'd see on the $250 Pro controllers out there. So you won't see the physical stops that you'd see on a more pro controller, but on here, they still activate equally as quick, which I'll show in the software, but it does activate with just the slightest press similarly. For myself, this was an easy case when testing this out while playing Overwatch, and it's definitely a nice to have feature. Outside of that, the triggers do work well, and I can definitely appreciate the full size over the Joy-Cons. And what makes this controller special is the overall feature set. Like I mentioned, apart from the great build, it has a lot of pro features that you would find on more expensive controllers. The first I'll mention is the turbo mode, which is easily set enough. I'll have a photo up here on how you can set up all the feature combos. You can swap the A, B, X, Y layout, you can set your macro buttons and map them to whatever else you need. And from an accessibility standpoint, this is awesome to have. You can't pull a trigger without a trigger finger, so if you are missing some digits, this is definitely a handy thing to have. And depending on how you like your rumble/vibrate, you can always change the intensity. It actually is pretty decent on this controller too, so I really can't complain. And you can also use the joysticks to change the intensity of your RGB or brightness. And if you really want to get down with customization for your controller, you can always use the TK4 software on PC. In here, you can set the color profiles, assign all your buttons, as well as change the trigger and stick settings. I can definitely see this being a good thing for anyone who prefers to have zero latency while gaming on a PC with a controller. Oh, and don't forget to update your controller when you plug it in. That's an absolute must. Okay, so there's a whole lot this controller can do, but what's missing? The first thing I want to mention, of course, is there's no wireless. Obviously, that would jack up the price a lot, and that depends, of course, on your preferences. Wired controllers will always just be plug and play, so that's something to keep in mind. Another thing I'll mention is that there's no PlayStation or Xbox support, but of course, I knew that going in, but I did have to test it out anyways, just something to be aware of. Anyways, that just about wraps up my review of the T4 Collide, and I can say I'm pleasantly surprised. If you can make do without the wireless and actually want a good pro controller that doesn't break the bank, that works on either PC or Switch, this is definitely a stellar option, especially at 42 bucks. Plus, I truly dig transparent tech. I'm pretty stoked that's making a comeback in 2023. But let me know down below in the comments if you have any comments or